In Chapter 1, we'll discuss the science of human development. So first of all, we need to have a working definition of what development is. And so as this slide indicates, the science of human development that seeks to understand how and why people of all ages and circumstances change or remain the same over time. Now, in the process of understanding how and why people change throughout time is they use the scientific method. And the scientific method, in a brief synopsis, is a way to answer questions using empirical research and database conclusions. So I just want to point out a couple of things here. On this word right here, empirical, that means evidence-based through direct observation and testing and coming up with data. And so that usually qualifies as what we call evidence. Now there's 5 basic steps of the scientific method, and these are the 5 steps in order. Number 1, just sort of, begin with curiosity, pose a question. So scientists, they may say, well, why does this certain age group experience this type of psychological growth or process, and so they start off with a question. And then they'll develop a hypothesis. And a hypothesis just simply means kind of like a prediction that will be either proven or unproven, and through the scientific process. And step number 3 is we will test the hypothesis. So that just simply means that the scientists will design a type of test that will seek to gather data and information, and then in order to test whether the hypothesis is really, we can use the terms true or untrue at this point, just keeping it very simple. And next to last, the scientist will draw conclusions. So they will actually examine the data that they got from the experiment or the scientific method, and then they will draw conclusions. They will say, therefore, my hypothesis is supported or is unsupported, that kind of thing. And last but not least, the scientist will report the results. And usually that is reported in scientific journals, that type of thing. Let's move on. So there is one more step to the scientific method that's pretty common and very important. And this is the step that is known as replication. And replication is simply repetition of a study using different participants. We want to repeatedly conduct the test in order to determine whether the original results and all the results from all the studies meld together and make a valid hypothesis. Okay, so we're going to move on and we're going to take a look at the nature versus nurture debate. And so nature, that generally refers to the traits, capacities, and limitations that each individual inherits genetically from his or her parents at the moment of conception. So that's hence the term nature, that is inherited genetic traits and information. Now, on the other hand, nurture, that's the term for all the environmental influences, the effect the environment has on the individual. So one thing that's important is I did put a reminder note down here that nature, it always affects nurture, and nurture always affects nature. They work interdependently. A couple of terms here just really quick for this slide here, and the first term is epigenetics, and that's a study of how the environment actually can alter genetic expression. And do not worry about some of these other terms like methylation, etc. This is just the important part here is just understand that epigenetics, that refers to how environment affects our genetic expression. We'll be moving on. Now, another thing too that is important to keep in mind is development is what's known as plastic. And plastic, that just means basically it can be molded. It's malleable. And so really quickly here, plasticity, that denotes two aspects of development. So human traits, they can be molded. And second, people maintain a certain durability of identity. So even though they are, that their traits can be molded and everything, they may still maintain a certain durability of their identity, the kind of a strength, a plastic strength. That's all we really need to know on this slide. And another, just really quick before I move on, that just made a couple quick notes, that human development, it's viewed as an ongoing, ever-changing interaction between physical and emotional being, between the person in every aspect of his or her environment, including the family and society. So one thing that's important to keep in mind is as we study the topics throughout this entire course, we'll always be approaching each topic from the biopsychosocial model. So we'll be seeking to understand the fundamentals of the biology, the psychology, and the sociology. That's as three important factors that relate to each topic. Now, here's just a few important terms, actually. Using the scientific method, conducting experiments and etc. But an experiment, here's a working definition, and the researcher tries to determine the cause and effect relationship between two variables. Now, the variable in itself, the term means able to change. It's it is able to experience what's called variation. That's why it's called a variable. So all we want to do is see if one variable causes the effect or change in another variable, and so that's that results in what we scientists call experiment. Now, since I did mention that there are two types of variables, there's the one that causes a change in another variable. So the one that causes the change, the effect it has, that is called the independent variable. So that's the one that actually will elicit a certain effect on the dependent variable. Then the dependent variable, that's the one that may change as a result of whatever the experimenter or the scientist does to the independent variable. So just briefly, I will give a very brief example here that maybe those in the medical industry or the neuroscience may experience or something. But take, for instance, independent variable, maybe a researcher is looking to see the effect of a certain drug on let's just say depression. And so the independent variable would be the drug. And so the scientist may say, okay, well, this group of people will receive 200 milligrams, whereas this group of people will receive 400 milligrams, et cetera, et cetera. And then the researcher will measure the effects that it has on the dependent variable. And the dependent variable in this instance would be the depression. I hope that explanation helps. So a couple of another important terms here to keep in mind is the experimental group. That is the subject. They're the ones that are subjected to the particular treatment. So take, for instance, in my previous explanation, the specific drug, or so that would be called the treatment. So they're the ones that receive the independent variable. Those are called the experimental group. Whereas the comparison group, they're the ones, they're also called a control group, but they do not receive the experimental group treatment. So take, for instance, in order to make sure that the specific treatment is really causing the effect, they want to have a group that receives no treatment just to compare those two, hence the word comparison group. Now here's just a very quick explanation how to conduct an experiment. And so just very briefly, I will very briefly go through this again just to reiterate some of these. But please feel free at any point during this video to pause the video and look at it a little more in depth. So remember, the first step is the researcher gets a lot of participants, okay, and then some are assigned to the experimental group. They receive the treatment, remember the independent variable, and then they want to see if there's change in the dependent variable. That was the predicted outcome, that was the hypothesis. Whereas another part of the group will get assigned to what's called the comparison or a control group. They are the ones that receive no treatment, and so they will hopefully no change in their dependent variable. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk about studying development over the lifespan. And I just wrote this really quickly here, remember developmentalists, they measure, how people change or remain the same over time. I know we've looked at that definition before, but I just want to say it a few times so, to help you to kind of remember that. Here's a few different types of research here. I do not expect you to memorize this, but I just want you to be aware that there are different ways to research groups. And so I am not going to go in depth on this slide. And moving on. But feel free to pause the video if you want to look at those a little more in depth. So here's an important term and a caution, actually, is the word correlation. And what correlation means is what correlation means, it's a relationship between maybe the two variables. So it doesn't mean causation. It doesn't mean that one treatment causes the change in the other variable or something like that. It just means there may be a correlation, but they can't claim that one variable causes change in the other. So hence they use the word correlation. Take for instance, let's just say caffeine. For those who, we can't say caffeine causes reduced sleep, because some people actually can have a pot of coffee right before going to bed and they will sleep just like a baby. And so what we can say though is caffeine is correlated with interrupted or reduced sleep patterns or something like that, but we can't say it causes it, because causes means that it would be applicable to all individuals. Just real briefly before we move on, a positive correlation, that just means that both variables, they will increase or decrease together. So take, for instance, a positive correlation may be study time and GPA. So as study time increases, GPA increases. Whereas a negative correlation, that's when one variable tends to increase while the other decreases. So we can talk about, remember I mentioned, caffeine and sleep. So as caffeine increases, sleep decreases. Remember this, we're talking about correlations, not causation. And then obviously zero correlation, that means no connection is evident at all. couple of terms here, important terms here that I'd like to make you aware of. Number one, quantitative research. That just means basically, remember, quantitative means numbers. So data that can be expressed with numbers. And qualitative research, on the other hand, that means qualities. So take, for instance, like they mention here, participants expressed ideas are often qualitative studies. So the quality of the participants' thoughts or ideas. Now, in research here, researchers must proceed and function according to ethical guidelines. And so basically a code of ethics. That's what's important on this slide. So a couple of things just want to make you aware of here, that those guidelines, ethical guidelines, those are actually established by an institutional review board. And they give you a couple of examples of how researchers must function ethically. For one, participation needs to be voluntary, confidential, and harmless. Can't cause harm to participants. And also research subjects, they must, receive, informed consent that they understand the research procedures and any risks involved. So they basically just need to be given a heads up on what the research is about. And that is the end of our slide presentation for Chapter 1. So please feel free to review it, and please get your study guides out and begin to answer the questions on the study guides.